Hello and welcome to the first episode of the 5 Minute Podcast Review, where the first podcast I'm going to review is actually this one, the 5 Minute Podcast Review. So, the idea of this podcast is that each episode I'm going to introduce you to 5 podcasts in around 5 minutes. Now, obviously, that means I don't go into great detail about each podcast, but that's the point, because I reckon the way most of us learn about new podcasts is through simple word of mouth. And that's what I'm trying to capture here. You know what it's like? You might be on a car trip, around the dinner table, at work or wherever, and someone mentions a podcast they've been listening to, and usually just from that brief chat, you can work out if the podcast might be one you'd be interested in checking out or even subscribing to. So with that said, the best way for me to demonstrate what this podcast is really all about is simply to roll straight into the next review, which is The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. So this is probably the podcast I've been listening to longest. If you've got an interest in the skills of critical thinking, that is, how to think smarter, how to avoid the logic traps we can all fall into, then listening to The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe over time will help you do just that. The panel's led by a guy called Steven Novella. He's a doctor, a neurologist at Yale University, and he really knows his stuff about how our brains work, and especially about how our brains can often fool us. So the format is a panel discussion, and it typically covers recent events from a skeptical or critical thinking perspective. They also have, there's a few regular segments, there's occasional guest interviews, and right now there are almost 600 back episodes of The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, or the SGU as it's known. So if you think it's something that's interesting to you, then there's definitely plenty of listening there. That's The Skeptic's Guide to the Universe. On to podcast number 3, which is Desert Island Discs. So the premise of Desert Island Discs is simple. Each episode, a celebrity or some notable person, could be anyone from Bill Gates to Kylie Minogue, is interviewed about the 8 pieces of music they would take with them if they were cast away on a desert island. So it's a great device to get a different perspective on people who you may have heard interviewed many times before, but listening to them as they explain their reasons for the 8 pieces of music they'd choose. And it's also a great way as a listener to expose yourself to a whole lot of new music. And just on the music, one of the things I like about Desert Island Discs is the way they only play a short sample of each track, say around 20 seconds or so. Now, this is for rights reasons because they don't have the copyright permission to play each track in full, but I actually think it's a strength of the podcast because it keeps things focused on the talk, on the person being interviewed. Now, as UK listeners will know, Desert Island Discs is an institution, having been broadcast on BBC radio since 1942. Unfortunately, a lot of the old recordings no longer exist, but plenty still do, and over 500 are available in the podcast archive. It's really worth trawling the archive and downloading the episodes that catch your interest. For example, there's Margaret Thatcher in 1978, before she was Prime Minister, talking about her 8 favourite pieces of music. It's a bit like travelling back in a time machine. Even listening to interviews from more recent times like the 80s, you're in this world where the internet didn't exist and 9/11 meant nothing. So that's Desert Island Discs, and in this case, discs is spelled with a C, as in D-I-S-C-S, not K-S. I know many podcast apps won't find it if you spell discs with a K. On to podcast number 4, and it's Here's the Thing with Alec Baldwin. So Here's the Thing is an interview podcast, and sometimes it seems like every second podcast is celebrity A interviewing celebrity B, and then sometimes celebrity B has their own podcast and interviews celebrity A back in return. So I guess you got to pick your celebrity podcast interviewers and interviewees. But what I like about Here's the Thing is that Alec Baldwin is a real insider to American popular culture. In fact, he's part of it. And this gives him access to a range of genuine A-list interviewees. People like Paul Simon, Dustin Hoffman, Michael Douglas, Julie Andrews, David Letterman, Billy Joel, Lena Dunham, Jerry Seinfeld. You get the idea. And on top of this, Alec and his guests have often known each other for years, even worked together on a TV show or whatever, so you have this real sense of eavesdropping on the kind of conversation they'd be having in real life with their guard down. Anyhow, if it sounds like something that could be of interest, check out Here's the Thing. On to podcast number 5, which is The Digested Read. This is the podcast version of a column from the UK's Guardian newspaper, which satirises the writing style of leading authors and their latest books. Now, if that doesn't quite make sense, I'm just going to play you a quick sample from an episode which satirises, or to put it more bluntly, takes the piss out of Malcolm Gladwell and his pop psychology. In this case, it's his book David and Goliath, but it could have been any one of Gladwell's books. Have a listen.
Richard is dyslexic. Most people would consider it to be a disadvantage. But Richard worked very hard, got a bit lucky, and founded his Virgin Empire. Richard could not have done this had he not been dyslexic. Having dyslexia is actually a blessing, and anyone who has the condition and has not become a billionaire should be ashamed. There was once a boy who looked a bit different. We'll call him Leo Sayre, because that's his name. Some people laughed at Leo because he had silly hair. Others didn't want to be his friend because he was always telling them that he was right and they were wrong. Leo decided to use his odd hair and off-putting mannerisms to his advantage and changed his name to Malcolm. Malcolm wrote a book telling people how everything they knew was wrong. It became a bestseller. So Malcolm wrote another book just the same, and another. He even rewrote Aesop's fables. Still, no one noticed. Malcolm cultivated a persona of being an outsider while earning huge amounts of money from banks, tobacco, and pharmaceutical companies. Malcolm earns more for a 1-hour talk than you will earn in a year. So who is laughing now?
So there you go. I guess that did not make much sense if you've never read any of Malcolm Gladwell's books, but other targets for the digested read include Hillary Clinton's Hard Decisions. There's a particularly cruel parody of Stephen Fry's latest autobiography. There's a great takedown of Russell Brand and his political manifesto called Revolution, and plenty more authors, including Steinbeck, J.D. Salinger, J.K. Rowling, Richard Dawkins, John le Carre, Hunter S. Thompson, Piers Morgan, Dan Brown, just to name some of them. So the last of the Digested Read podcasts seems to have gone up at the end of 2015, although the newspaper column is still going, so I'm not sure what the story is there, but there's plenty of Digested Read podcasts in the back collection. It's probably one of those podcasts where you just run down the list and pick off just those authors that you're familiar with. Well, so there you have it. First episode, 5 podcasts. You can find a list and links to the podcast mentioned at the show notes, which are at 5minutepodcastreview.wordpress.com. That's with the numeral 5, so numeral 5minutepodcastreview.wordpress.com. And there's also contact details on the page so you can get in touch. I'll definitely look forward to hearing from you, especially if you want to let me know about any podcasts you've discovered that are worth sharing, or maybe even your own podcast. Well, that really is it. I have gone over my 5 minutes, though I did say the top 5 podcasts in around 5 minutes. So I will see you on the next episode with 5 more podcasts. Thanks for listening.